Hello, this is a message called the Offensive Cross. It's based on Galatians 5, 1 to 12 and 1 Corinthians 1, 18 to 25. My husband stands out. People that know him know that he stands out for a number of reasons, but one particular way in which he stands out is that he wears a lot of Christian t-shirts. He has one with faith in a heart. He has another one about the words of Christ being imprinted on our hearts. And he gave me this one, which I'll talk about later on. I think the Apostle Paul might have particularly liked this t-shirt belonging to my husband. So as you can see, this one says, I'm on Team Jesus. I'm not religious. I'm a Christian, perfect and unworthy, saved by grace, seeking after God. In the book of Galatians, which we've been looking at for the past few weeks, Paul explains how being on Team Jesus is very different to being on Team Religious. He's angry about how some teachers, who he believes are teaching something contrary to the gospel, have been saying that all Christians must adopt Jewish customs such as circumcision. Being on Team Religious means following God by keeping certain rules. But Team Jesus know they are saved by grace, by accepting and being accepted by God, not by anything they can humanly do. We are, as the t-shirt says, and Paul confirms, imperfect and unworthy. Following the way of the cross means admitting and acknowledging this. In Galatians 5, 1 to 12, Paul uses some fantastic images to explain to the Galatians and to us what freedom in Christ truly means. He describes the Jewish law as a yoke that has fallen away now that Jesus has given us our liberty. It's an image from slavery. The law keeps people in chains. The shackles fall to the floor when we accept Christ, who has taken away the guilt we could never have ridded ourselves of. So he's talking as if the law keeps people in chains and then the chains just fall off when Christ takes away all the bad things that we've done, all the mistakes that we've made, and that gives us freedom. And so Paul talks about this like an image of slaves being freed. Our children in our church made kites also to represent the grace that they could fly away and be free of all mistakes, thanks to the grace of Jesus. Paul says to the Galatians, you were running a good race. Who cut in on you and kept you from obeying the truth? In 1 Corinthians, Paul also compares the Christian life to running a race. Like an athlete in the Olympic Games, Christians run for the prize or crown, which will last forever, being with Jesus. But in the Galatian church, someone cut in, like another runner blocking the path ahead. This was someone from the circumcision group, someone from Team Religious, trying to persuade the Galatian Christians that they still needed the law. This is getting in the way of Team Jesus, following the gospel as they should. Paul says a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. Just as Jesus spoke of something tiny, such as a mustard seed or yeast, leading to the growth and spread of his kingdom, so it can work the other way too. A little false teaching can spread and cause confusion to Christians. So we have this idea of Christians running a race, and that the people from the circumcision group are kind of, as the new Christians are running forwards, the people who want them to follow the Jewish law are cutting in, blocking their path as they run. That's the image that Paul uses to show how it's really getting in the way, what these other people are saying about needing to follow the Jewish law. And then he talks about the image of yeast or a mustard seed. So Jesus spoke about the kingdom, and I spoke about that in the message that I called Your Kingdom Come, about how we looked at how something so tiny as a mustard seed or yeast can expand and grow. And that's what Jesus compared the kingdom to. There could be this expansion, this growth. But Paul is saying that just as the kingdom can grow, so can this false teaching, these wrong things that the circumcision group are saying, that can also spread. And just so Christians can be blocked when they're running the race, they can also have this false teaching that spreads. Paul goes on to declare that if circumcision and following other laws is still needed, then the offence or stumbling block of the cross has been abolished. This is where we, as members of Team Jesus, can stand out. This is where we, as Team Jesus, can actually cause offence. By not following the norms and practices of either the Jewish or Greek ways of life, and by bringing a different ethic, a different way of living, Paul made people angry and brought persecution on himself. Jesus brings an offensive kind of love, and it cost him his life and those of many of his followers. In the Gospel of John, we read Jesus' words to his disciples. He has chosen them out of the world, and the world will hate them for it. The cross isn't comfortable, it isn't cozy, and people like comfortable and cozy. So Paul was willing to live this different way of life, even if it meant that life was very hard for him, if not actually painful. But he's saying that if these laws are brought back in, then the offence of the cross, the way that it stands out, might as well be taken away if you're going to follow these rules. And Jesus also spoke about the fact that his disciples were in the world and yet not of the world, and that they might actually come up in conflict with the world's values. The world might actually, he uses a strong enough word of hating them, that they might be so at odds with the world that it would actually cause really strong feelings. So the cross isn't cozy, isn't comfortable. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who have been saved, it is the power of God. He goes on, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Paul was prepared to look foolish or even to be offensive if it meant he was following his Lord. He deeply cared for the people in the churches he was involved with, but this never led him to compromise his values. He knew his calling was to serve Christ and not the world, however uncomfortable that made life for him. So he's saying that we might look foolish. We talked at my church about the ways in which people might find us hard to understand as Christians. And Paul talks about the fact that we may appear as foolish, or to Jewish people, there may be a problem of relying on grace. But he was courageous enough to stick by what Christ had taught him, to stick by the Christian way of life, even though, as we've said, this made things very difficult for him at times. If we are truly followers of Christ, this will sometimes be uncomfortable for us because our values are potentially offensive to wider society. Let's face it, we are odd. Our idea of living life to the full can look very different to the secular versions, or at least I hope they look different, distinctive. We recognise Jesus as Lord in a society that's suspicious of authority. We live in terms of family and community in a world which pushes individualism. We put ourselves before others in a society that sells putting ourselves first. We have ethical standards that we won't budge on in a society where everything is relative and people can make their own morality. We talk about sin in a world that thinks of the concept of sin as outdated and silly. At our best, we are self-controlled and we get up early on Sundays. So there's these different features of our society in the UK. It tends to be individualistic. It tends to encourage us to put ourselves first. It tends to expect us to adapt certain morals. Um, and it tends to think of sin as being an outdated concept. And we as Christians are taught by biblical teaching, taught by Christ, to live differently to this, to be more communal, to be thinking of others, to hold on to moral truths and not to give way on them. This is not to say that we should consider ourselves better or superior to people who do not share our faith. Sadly, Christians do not always display Christ-like qualities, and God is working in the lives of those outside the church, whether they recognise it or not, in every kind gesture or thoughtful response. 1 Peter tells us we should talk about our faith with gentleness and respect. So I'm not saying that we're the only people who act in a moral way, not at all. But what I would say is that where there is any kindness and consideration, then I believe that Jesus is working in that. We are in the world and yet not of the world. It is so easy to be persuaded, just like the Galatians were being, to be of the world rather than on Team Jesus. Are we being persuaded away from Christ? What are we being persuaded to? Are we going along too much with society's way of doing things rather than Christ's way of doing things? It's a tricky balance. Are we doing things our own way, on our own? Are we giving up on what we know to be right just to fit in? Are we getting pulled into a consumer society? So we want to be involved in the world, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, we should think about being distinctive, think about being followers of Christ rather than followers of the world. So back to the Christian t-shirts. Just stop sharing this screen. I hope we can all wear t-shirts that are offensive, or at least wear a t-shirt that makes people think. So my t-shirt here, I don't know if you can see that, says Father, Saviour, Spirit, Healer, Redeemer, got a cat on me, Lord of all, you are the only one. I would love this to show people that God can heal them, that God can redeem them, that He is my Lord, my number one. I hope this could start a conversation about how He heals and how I can value an unseen God over my friends and family. So we had some conversations at our church about how people can sometimes ask for prayer, even if they don't necessarily believe themselves to have a faith in God. And perhaps that can start a conversation about what we believe about God's redemption. I pray that my life shows more than my t-shirt. I pray that yours does too. I pray that we can all be gently offensive.